Firstly, thanks all. Thanks for taking a minute. It is one of the true pleasures of this campaign is to get to spend moments like this with people from across this district who are excited or as excited as we are about building the kind of future that we envision for North Central Washington. So truly, it gives me just deep joy to be in a virtual room with you all. I hope someday to be in an actual room with you all again. Thanks for taking a moment. Thanks for joining us. This is sort of our last hurrah. I'm sure we'll have little mini additional events over the course of the next 27 days, but this was the last big push. So thanks for making it all possible. I said a minute ago that we had raised over $3,500 in this event before it even started. So thank you all for making that possible. It is through events like these and through the small donations of folks like you that this campaign has been fueled. We are 27 days away from November 3rd and 10 days away from ballots dropping. And it is kind of unbelievable to be here, but a testament to all of you that we are. You know, tonight we're here to talk a little bit about the campaign, but mostly about protecting this beautiful place that we call home. My family homesteaded on a farm a few miles from the Columbia River in the 1880s and near what we now call Lake Roosevelt. And I was born near where the Smokier River meets the lake on a farm irrigated by its waters. And we grew up with the Grand Coulee Dam as the backdrop to our lives and the stories about it that are so important in this moment about how the dams were built by just the sheer grit and determination of rural people like us, and about how the Great New Deal invested back into local economies, about union labor and how it sent kids to colleges like the University of Washington or the WSU, and about how they bought houses. And I think that's really important right now as we head into another recession. I grew up in a family that lived paycheck to paycheck. I became a mom before I turned 20 myself, and I worked my way through college, and I came back to North Central Washington and helped build a thriving social and health services nonprofit. I see folks from Room 1 here on the call tonight, which is so fun to see that legacy continue. And that nonprofit served our working families and our aging neighbors and children across the district. And through that work, I saw how hard it was, how much harder it was getting for rural people in this district to just make it. And at the root of that is whether or not policy works for us or it works against us. And tonight we're here to talk about the interchange of climate and water and how policy intersects with whether or not we get to live in a future that is nourishing and safe for all of us here in North Central Washington. And we're also here to talk about who we are as rural and small town people and about what's at stake, what we have to fight for right now. As we enter another recession, as the world becomes less stable for our children, as fires continue to ravage this community that we call home, there's a choice on the table right now. And I think we are clearly staking our claim on where we want this future to go for us here in North Central Washington. And it gives me such joy to be amongst rural people that are just like the rural people that built that dam 100 years ago. They are people with grit and determination, and we can once again come together to build a future for all of us here in North Central Washington. That's why I'm running and why I'm so excited to have you all in this with us. So thank you for being here. Thank you for joining. At the very end, we'll share a little bit more about this campaign and the incredible strides we've made. We have raised almost $110,000, which is our goal for the campaign. And we have had over 700, I think actually 800, I looked tonight, contributions to the campaign from over 600 folks. Most of those are small donors. So many people gave $12, $50, $100. I've called and asked people why they gave to this campaign, and they often say it's the first time that they've given to a campaign, and they are just dang excited to have someone who reflects their values in a rural community like this. It doesn't happen very often, and I am so excited to be part of that vision that we have here. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. For tonight, I am so excited to be here with a few folks. But before I introduce them, I want to thank our co-hosts, Susan Butrell, Judy Durpak, Derek Sheffield, Jesus Hernandez and Crystal Eshelman, Jasmine Minbashi and Kelly Edwards and Ken Libby, Dr. Jesse Charles, Michelle Sandoval, Danny Golden and Josh Cole, Tom Robinson and Joan Wellman, Chris Cameron, Mary and Greg Moga, Amy and Dale Massey, Allison Miller, Melissa Arnaud, Joan Causey and Becca Wendell, and a special thanks, kind of a fun one, to Ingrid Backstrom, a professional freestyle skier from the 12th District who has helped get the word out, and we'll have a little Facebook Live with her later this month. So thank you all for making this night possible. And honestly, that list of names are people who have powered this campaign for the last few months. So thank you all for being a part of this. We are so grateful to you. You know, the one thing I want to say before I introduce our guests is that I'm in this race because I believe that the person who I'm running against isn't representing us. You know, we have raised $108,000 from 800 contributions, and my opponent has raised about 178 contributions, including leading donors like Chevron and Phillips 66 and Avista, tobacco companies and fossil fuel companies. And we can say that money doesn't have influence, and we also know that it's just not true. The evidence isn't behind that. So one of the things my opponent often talks about is taking back East Side values and East Side interests. And I'd say, hey, that's what we're doing. Here we are as a community really owning the values of Eastern Washington, really owning the future that we all long for here in North Central Washington. I am fifth generation Eastern Washingtonian, and when I take money from the people of this district, it is because those are the people that I am beholden to. Those are my people and the people that I will serve if elected to office. So with that, I am so excited to get to have a conversation about this land that we all love, about the exchange of climate and fire. We have Paul Hessburg, a fire ecologist and research scientist with the University of Washington College of Environment, and the research behind Era of Mega Fires. If you haven't seen Era of Mega Fires, please look for it. It is an incredible film and an invaluable story about the intersections of wildfire, forest conditions, and climate. He's also a North Central Washington local, Wenatchee man, which we love, and such an important part of our community. So Paul will join us for the second half for our Q&A. Bill McKibben, who answers his phone, we know, because when Charlotte Massey, one of our campaign field organizers, called, he actually answered and said, yes, thank you, Bill, for being a part of the people and being willing to answer your campaign. He is the founder of Free50.org, a leader in the grassroots movement for climate change, and widely known as one of the most important global thinkers on climate change. And Casey Golden, one of our dear people here in the Methow Valley, former energy policy director for the state of Washington, helped develop Climate Solutions, which is an important organization in the Northwest. And honestly, one of just the brightest, most lovely people I know. When we talk about working people and the interchange with climate, you know, I'm leading with a platform for working people of this district. That's who I am. That's the people that I am going to be representing. And we know that that means we have to lead on climate change. And when I think about someone who wants to do that, I think of Casey. So thank you, Casey, for being willing to be a part of this tonight. I think we can start by just opening it up to Bill. Will you introduce yourself, and then we'll just dive right into questions. I also want to say to all of you, this is only as fun as you make it. Please ask questions in the text box. We will try to lift them up throughout tonight. We'll have an opportunity to have a little bit of a dialogue as we near the end. Casey and I will open up with some questions we've been excited to ask, and then all of you can join in with any questions you might have. But before we start, Bill, will you give us a little intro to who you are?
Sure. What a pleasure to get to join you all. I'm the interloper here from back east. But in fact, I love the state of Washington almost as much as I love the state of Vermont, where I live. It's where my father's family all comes from. My beloved grandfather was mayor of and the only doctor in the town of Kirkland for 50 years, back when it was not a Microsoft or Costco suburb, but back when it was a little shipbuilding town. And my father grew up taking the ferry to Seattle so he could go to Six Stadium to watch the Seattle Rainiers every chance he got. And I still have kin scattered all over the state of Washington, and I get there as often as I can. And your part of the state is one of the places that I just treasure. I've gotten to wander the Methow and see much of that part of the world. And well, I mean, right now today, the leaves in Vermont are at their absolute peak, so I wouldn't trade it for any place in the world. But if I had to, North Central Washington would be high on the list. And so I just want to say thanks to Adrianne and everybody else for their work that they're doing to protect it. You don't need me to tell you the state that we're in now. I mean, I wrote the first book for a general audience about climate change 30 some years ago, back in 1989. And at the time, we were offering warnings about what was going to happen if we didn't take action. And then we didn't take action. And now, sadly, the warnings are coming true, which you guys know more about than most people, because summer after summer, now you get to breathe the air that's full of the smoke. And it's not supposed to be like that, but that's inevitably what happens. Temperatures get as high as they get now. Paul is the real authority here, but it was, not a surprise to anybody that we have the worst fires, say, in the history of California this summer, because we had the highest temperatures in the history of California this summer. In fact, in August, it got hotter in California, 130 degrees Fahrenheit, than we have ever measured on this planet before. That's where we're headed. But the good news is we don't need to go much farther down that road if we don't want to. The scientists and engineers have done their job. The last 10 years, we've dropped the price of renewable energy 90%. The sun and the wind and the batteries that can store that power are now the cheapest way to generate energy on our planet. And so we're poised, if we want to make big changes fast. And the states that get ahead of those changes are going to be the ones that prosper, the ones that are able to drive us into this new world and benefit from it. And the places that don't, the places that try to just not change at all, to keep, the Chevrons and whatever of the world stuck with their old business plans. Well, I mean, it's pretty easy to predict how that's going to end up at this point. So, look, I spend a lot of my time, as my old colleague Casey knows, working on what's happening with energy policy in China or in India or all the sort of biggest. But you know what? It matters extraordinarily what happens in the United States too, and what happens on the West Coast of the United States, and the possibility for the Northwest to be an absolute center of innovation and change in the best possible way, a way that restores power to local communities, that allows people to power their communities with the resources, the sun and the wind, that fall on North Central Washington instead of the oil that happens to be sitting underneath Saudi Arabia or wherever it is. So it's a real possibility, and it's really good to see people like Adrianne seizing that possibility and helping lead us in that direction. And I really could not be more grateful to her and to all of you for being willing to try and make that happen. Climate change is the biggest crisis that human beings have run up against. And so it's some ways daunting to have to take it on, but in some other ways, it's a great honor too. Y'all are getting to work on what is the biggest problem that there is, and you're getting to do it in a way that really counts. So I am super grateful.
Thanks, Bill. I really appreciate you joining us tonight. I told Casey he got to introduce you, and then I
Yeah,
stole his thunder.
yeah.
So,
No.
Casey, would you like to share anything about why you're here tonight and kick us off with some information and questions for Bill?
Thanks, Adrianne, and thanks. It's just so great to see all these faces and all these friends and all the new energy among old friends that this campaign is generating. And even more so to see all the new energy and engagement on the part of a lot of people who might not feel like they're fully enfranchised as citizens in this district and have been pretty alienated from the political process. And that juice and that growing electorate and that growing sense of excitement about what political leadership could look like, I just feel so fortunate to be part of a community where we're seeing the rise of that kind of political leadership that Adrianne represents. You know, it's political leadership that comes right straight up out of the heart of the community and our community institutions. She's helped build some of the strongest of those institutions. It's the kind of leader who you don't wonder whose interests they're serving once they are elected. You know that they're working for you, and especially the kind of leader who's getting younger folks excited and engaged because she speaks authentically to their concerns and interests. That's my daughter calling. Speaking of young people, sorry about that. I heard Joe Biden say the other day that if he wins, he sees his role as a transitional president, a sort of handoff to a whole new generation of leaders that are coming into their own and to whom his generation will pass the torch. And I'm just super pumped knowing there are leaders as strong as you, Adrianne, out there reaching to grab that torch right now, and really, really excited to be part of it and help any way I can. I'm going to kick off, if that's okay, a little Q&A with Bill. And I think that while Adrianne and I do a few questions, we're also going to have some room for questions from the chat if people want to start loading them in there. And we'll just kind of ad lib our way through this. Bill, I didn't get to introduce you, but geez, I just got to say, you know, maybe 10 years ago, it was starting to become clear that the movement for climate solutions wasn't really a movement at all and was kind of stalled. And you know, we had all the science we needed to move forward. We didn't need another scientist to tell us that. Even by then, we knew we had the solutions that we were going to need. We didn't need too many more engineers and economists on that. All that was in place. It turned out we were kind of stuck in the wrong story about climate change, a story where we really didn't feel like we had much of a shot, or we knew how to stop it and to intervene, and what our role was in that story. So it turned out what the climate movement really needed most of all was a really good writer. So when Bill stepped into that role and started rewriting the story of climate change, it was about 10 years ago when he really, you know, formed 350 and stepped fully into that role. And it is not a coincidence that I think we can trace the birth of what we can truly call a citizen-led, grassroots, irresistible, loud, plucky climate movement began. And Bill put that on his shoulders, and he hasn't taken too many days off since. He's got the war wounds to show for it. Brother, it's just really good to have you on this. I know you got a lot going on in national races, and to have you spend this time with us is just fantastic. You went over some of the stuff I wanted to ask about, but I wanted to ask you, this is a pretty conservative district overall. And you got a pretty friendly audience on this call, but it's not an audience that's big enough to win this election in this district, and it's a polarized district. And I think, you know, some of the most widespread information sources that people are gobbling up have served up a lot of disinformation about climate. How do we get folks together across political lines in a community like this to advance solutions or, you know, build a winning constituency in a community where there's this kind of tribal tension that has really focused itself around climate?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. I've lived my whole life in rural America, some of it in quite purple Vermont, much of it in the very red upstate New York. So I'm kind of used to that kind of environment. Let me say a couple of things. One is that things are shifting fast. Partly it's because of movements and what they do, but partly it's because Mother Nature is an extraordinary educator. And at this point, you have to be trying pretty hard to pretend that we're not in trouble. Inland, watching fires year after year rake across the landscape, and on the coasts, we're watching now as Hurricane Delta, we're well into the Greek alphabet, having exhausted the regular alphabet. Hurricane Delta is hurtling towards Louisiana now. I mean, this is not the world that any of us grew up in. And I think people are starting to realize that. I think, too, that people are starting to realize in new ways that we really do have to pay attention to science in all kinds of ways. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that physical reality is real and you can't just talk your way around it, though obviously some of our leaders try. And it's also taught us and reminded us that we kind of have to rely on social solidarity, on helping each other. Most of us kind of grew up in the political shadow of Ronald Reagan and of his sort of oft-repeated idea that markets were going to solve all problems by themselves, and none of us would have to do anything, and government was the problem, not the solution. And Reagan always said, well, the 9 scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help, which was his big joke. But really, it just is not true. I mean, the scariest words in the English language are things like, we've run out of ventilators, or the hillside behind your house caught on fire. And you can't, those things don't bend to just because you have a lot of money or something. Those require you have a working society in order to deal with them. So I think more and more people are sensing, even if it's hard for anybody to kind of change their orientation, sort of sensing that we have to, but also, and I think this is the really optimistic part, sensing that what comes next is kind of cool. When we do polling, one of the things we find, Americans are extremely polarized about everything. They fight about everything. The one thing that people across America agree on by huge percentages, about 85 to 15%, and this is Republicans and independents and Democrats, is that there should be more renewable energy and more government support for renewable energy. People really like solar panels. Now, they may like them for different reasons, okay? It's possible that arch conservatives really just like the idea that you get a solar panel up on the roof and then your house is entirely your castle and you never have to talk to anyone again. And it's possible that, liberals really like it because it's like the, groovy power of the sun is, powering your life. Whatever. It's all good, because this is clearly the direction, renewable energy, sun, wind, that we need to be going, and quickly. And, the people who really like it at this point are people with the kind of eye on the bottom line. People figuring out that this is going to be a cheap, efficient way to power the future that'll get us out of some of the incredibly expensive mess that we've gotten ourselves into. If you think it's been expensive and difficult dealing with the pandemic, think of it as a kind of preview for what the century is going to be like if we don't manage to head off climate change fairly fast. And I find that that's something that all kinds of people really understand. And I will say that in certain ways, I find this argument easier to make in rural areas than suburban ones, because people in rural America are actually in touch with the world around them. I'll tell you who In our part of the world, which is pretty wet and which has seen huge increase in flooding rain, I'll tell you who the easiest people to get this argument across to about climate change are local highway superintendents and people who run the DPW in town, because they've spent the last 2 decades ripping out all the 8-inch culverts and putting in 12-inch culverts because the old rule book just doesn't work anymore. The old rules of thumb about how much it can rain in a 24-hour period don't apply anymore because we've changed the physics of the planet. And they know that there's a limit to how big a culvert you can put in. At a certain point, the road is just underwater. Well, in your part of the world, it may be less flooding and more to do with fire or whatever it is. Thank God we don't have to deal with that too much yet out here, because it scares the living hell out of me just to watch the pictures. But whatever it is, we're at a point now where I think it's easier for people to see.
I think you're so right, Bill, that in rural areas like ours, not only are we at the front of the interchange between our natural environments and the climate crisis, but we're also, we're connected to the land for our livelihoods and for our recreation and for our children's well-being. So I think it's absolutely true, and why you have so many people here. I have all of these questions I want to ask, but there's so many good ones in the chat. Casey, can we go completely off script and ask a couple in the chat? Okay, and then we'll come back to it. We'll also have a moment to talk with Paul Hessburg, who is an expert on the interchange of fire and climate too. So I'm going to save a couple of the fire ones and local ones for that moment. But one of the things that we have often thought and talked about, as a good middle child, I want everyone to be happy, and yet it's also really important that we hold our elected representatives accountable for who they are and what they're doing and the policies that they either are forwarding or are not forwarding in response to, what we need to do as a community, what the pressing obligations are for us to be able to secure our futures. And, one of the questions was about how my opponent is taking money from big corporate PACs, including big oil companies. And somewhere in here, I think Joshua Porter asked that he was inspired by your example in 2006 in going for climate commitments from people running for office. And he got to walk with you from the church in Charlotte to Shelburne Farms, and committing to below 350 ppm was what we were asking for on that walk. And he wonders, what specific commitments do you think we should be asking from our candidates for local office?
Well, that is a great question and a great memory of the kind of very early days of the climate movement here in Vermont and some of the first big protests in the country. And over time, our understanding of what we need our leaders to do has changed, because the science, for two reasons. One, the science has changed slowly and we understand exactly how tight a predicament we're in. And the other is we haven't done anything. So each year we don't do anything. The amount that we have to do and the time we have left gets harder and harder. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the world's climate scientists sort of brought together under their own auspices, every few years publishes a new report with all the latest climate science summarized. And their most recent report came in October of 2018. And it said that if we wanted to come anywhere near meeting the targets that we'd set in Paris in 2015, that we would need to, in their words, fundamentally transform our energy systems by 2030. And they defined fundamentally transform as cut emissions in half. So there's a fairly good set of marching orders for us all to figure out how we're going to do that. And it turns out we're not going to do it mostly through individual change, though that is important. I mean, I'm proud of the solar panels that are all over my roof, and I'm glad I now drive an electric car and so on and so forth, but I don't fool myself that that's how we're going to do this. At this point, we can't make that kind of math work that fast. And you get a sense of that during the pandemic because we all shut down our lives in ways that none of us have ever experienced during our decades on the planet. And yeah, it cut emissions some, like 8 or 9%, which is good, but it really isn't all that much. And it's a reminder of how much of this is hardwired into our systems. So we need to go into those systems and rip out the coal and gas and oil and put in a lot of insulation and a lot of conservation and a lot of sun and wind and some storage batteries. And so that's what we need our legislators working on. And I think probably the most important thing is to have them focused on 2030, not on 2050. 2050 is far enough away that it's the kind of date that politicians like because they're not going to be responsible for it. I mean, Adrianne's young enough that she might have to, but for the most part, our political class can safely make promises for 2050, secure in the knowledge that they will be well retired by the time it comes around. 2030 is when we need action, real serious action by. The next decade may be the last decade when we have serious leverage still to affect the outcome of how high the temperature is going. So that's why it's so important to have. We're running out of elections that matter, I guess is what I'm trying to say. This isn't a fight for the long run, it's a fight for the short term. And that urgency, that time is, I think, Joshua, the most important thing.
I want to bring Paul into this conversation. And while I do that, Casey, do you want to figure out which next question you would like to bring? Yeah. But Paul, would you take a moment to introduce yourself, your work, and then we'll just have a conversation between us with these brilliant questions that our neighbors have offered up.
You bet. Thanks, Adrianne. I'm excited to be able to be excited about the 12th district. I'm a fire scientist. I've been working in the West studying forests and forest change and fire ecology changes for the last 4 decades. And one of the things I really wanted to be able to underscore in light of some of these great comments is that while people are focusing on the next 30 years, we're going to run out of time far before the next 30 years. The IPCC is running new calculations on how climate and wildfire in North America are interacting. And one of the things they're finding out is they projected in 18 that the burned area from 2000 to 2020 would double or triple by 2050. Now that number is, it will increase 4 or 5-fold in the next 3 decades. And that means by 2050 for our forests, the game is over. So we literally need to start acting. Another thought that's very critical is that in 2017 and 2018, wildfire emissions overtook the sum of all other emissions in other sectors in 2 years. So we literally had fossil fuel emissions plus wildfire emissions, creating an acceleration in warming because of the tremendous input of wildfire-caused greenhouse gases. So I can't underscore enough how incredibly important it is that action takes place within the next decade. 2 decades from now, in terms of Eastern Washington and Western US forests, for example, the game will have been long over. So what Bill said is incredibly timely about the time to take action and the impossibility of creating success if we postpone. Time is now. It's 2020. It's next year. It's deeply concerning, and as a climate scientist and a wildfire scientist, I can't unsee the data. It haunts me constantly. And as a grandfather, I'm incredibly worried about what I'm leaving behind for my kids and my grandkids. So this is an incredibly important time for us to not only embrace the importance of a warming climate, but we're living in the worst case scenario in Eastern Washington. I look at the data every week. We're already living in the worst case scenario from the 2018 IPCC report. That's what's driving our fire ecology. So I can only underscore the things that have been said. From a scientific point of view, we're rapidly running out of time. And we're literally in the bullseye in the Western United States.
You know, Paul, thank you for coming. Keith, I'll turn it over to you in just one second. But one of the things that has been just incredibly important and just joyful for me to see is the young people in our district leading this moment. We have over 40 people who are organizing for this campaign, 40 young people organizing for this campaign. And when we get on our weekly calls with them and talk about the issues that matter most to them, climate is at the top of that list. I went to a climate march in Leavenworth the other day that was put on by high school students in Leavenworth. And one of the things that they said is, Aiden, if I misquote you, you have to forgive me, but he said something like, I know we're aiming for 2050 and I know that we're all tired of change, but we need the change, you know, we need to make this change right now for my generation. And I think that they are going to lead us towards this future we want. And I know you complimented me, Bill, on being 21 for the 18th year, but it's, I think, even the people younger than us who are going to be leading this moment. So in a minute, I would love to hear about how you all are thinking about leading with young people at the forefront. But first, Casey, let me turn it over to you to ask a question from our audience.
Wow, tough choice. So many great questions.
Oh.
The people with the forest fire questions and the relationship between forest management and climate and forest fires, get in touch with Paul. And there's lots of good resources on that in the Valley. But I'm going to give you a question, Bill, from Jasmine Minbashian, who runs our Meadow Valley Citizens Council, one of our really great gems of a local advocacy and citizens group. They are working on a climate strategy for the Meadow Valley as we face growing fire seasons and water shortages. They're close to releasing a draft, but I know that they're still working on ideas. From your experience around the world, do you have some inspiring examples you can share of really meaningful things that local communities have done on their own initiative on behalf of climate solutions, both in ways that, you know, build their communities and are great for their communities and also connect in a meaningful way to the global challenge?
Yeah, communities are figuring out how to do all kinds of things. Now, let's preface this by saying that we don't call it global warming for nothing, and it truly is a global crisis. And the most efficient ways to deal with the problems are as high up the food chain as you can get, in a sense. You know, we have to have some global solutions, and we sort of have some of that through the Paris agreements. We have to have national commitments, which maybe after November 3rd will be a possibility. We have to have state governments doing their thing and local governments too. There's obviously financial limits on what local governments are able to do by themselves and local communities, but they can do a lot anyway. Transportation can be, which is maybe a third of America's greenhouse gas emissions, can be deeply affected by the ways that local communities figure out how to get things done. And the communities that have managed to really turn, in where I live, rural public transportation and also bicycling and human-powered transportation into legitimate options are really. Now, I'm kind of the wrong person to be talking about bicycling right at the moment. My shoulder is in a sling because I went over the handlebars not long ago. So, you know, wear your helmet. But those are, you know, that's one example. Another example is across America, the poorest people in rural America are the ones, I mean, I assume this is true where you are, it's true where I am. If you go around on a cold winter day, you can see who's heating the outdoors because you can see the waves of heat coming out through badly insulated houses with single pane windows. These are the kind of things that communities can organize to figure out pretty quickly how to help repair. I noticed in the chat the good question from Joan about the cost, say, of doing solar on individual homes. And it's true, it's difficult. That's why in Olympia, you need people who are doing the kind of things to help set up the financing systems that allow people to easily take advantage of these new technologies, which will start saving them money from day one, but you have to be able to finance, in order to put together. But even at the local level, one can do an enormous amount. We do a lot of these installation bees and things in our part of the world, just to help people, just to help them make sure that they're not wasting money nor carbon on heating the outdoors. So there are a ton of interesting projects that communities are figuring out how to do, just in the way that they lay themselves out as they grow and expand, in the kind of businesses they're trying to attract, on and on and on.
Paul, I'm going to lob this next question to you. You know this district as well as any of us here, and it's a pretty conservative district overall. And most of the widespread and trusted information sources here have served up a lot of disinformation. One of the reasons I decided to run was I went to a town hall with my opponent, and we asked him about how he was going to address climate change and fire, and he said that he believed that fire was part of that the fires we were seeing were part of a natural cycle, and he wasn't so sure about the science behind climate change. So I wonder for you, Paul, how do you bring people together across political lines, across divides in a community like this to advance the solutions that science is offering us?
Wow, that's loaded. I believe in my Year of Megafires talks and sometimes lengthy Q&As afterwards, I try to represent the current climate and wildfire predicament as an ecological and a climatological problem or a social problem with an ecological and climatological explanation. But we have designs on the landscape. If we weren't here, these ecosystems would sort something out over time. But we value these ecosystems and we rely on them and we need things from them. And for spiritual, recreational, commercial reasons, a variety of reasons, we love our forests and we want them to be there for the future. And the solutions are not going to be simply scientific solutions. They're going to be getting citizens, sociologists, ecologists, folks of all stripes together and talking about the facts and staying within the outline of the facts. And then asking the question, what do we want? What do we want from these forests for the future? And what does it take to get there? I believe that conversation is critical for Eastern Washington. And we have lawmakers at all levels that we can work with to create better designs for that future than the ones that we're living in. And for me, that means that we start working concretely with lawmakers at all levels to work towards designs for the future that make the most sense and derive the values that are important to us. And we're not on that trajectory at all right now. In fact, we're completely orthogonal to that. We're 90 degrees to that trajectory in Washington State. But it's not a science-based solution. It needs to stay within the outline of the factual science. But it's scientists and managers and citizens working together to say, what do you value? What does it take to get there? What do we know about these systems so that we can do something different to move them in a better trajectory? One that produces less severe fire, less smoke, forests for the future. Almost everything has a sort of a coupled human natural system component. It's just not about the science anymore. It's about getting people together to negotiate the futures they want to live in.
Yep. I think the framing of this as a choice and a question and a moral question that we have to ask ourselves is just right now. I want to play on a question that Chris Cameron offered earlier on. After the 2014-15 wildfires, a lot of folks in this room and I worked together on standing up the response to the fires and making sure that everybody had access to resources. But we also saw that though climate change and the crises of a fire affects everybody, it doesn't affect everybody equally. And we saw that most recently in the fires where we went out and were sitting with farm workers who were being bused each day to their jobs where they were picking in the middle of catastrophic wildfires and smoke. And Chris asks about conflict in Syria and its origins being in drought that drove farmers into the cities. And my question for both of you, Bill and Paul, because it's both a deeply local issue, this is true here and it is true in Syria, that poor and working people will be the most affected by climate change while they have offered the least input to creating the problem. So how do we frame this response on poor and working people? How do we ensure that they are brought in not only to the question, but also into leading the response to climate change, both within our district and across the world?
Well, let me say, I mean, this is true the world over. The iron law of climate change is the less you did to cause it, the sooner and the harder you suffer from it. And it's true in America, and it's obscenely true when you look at, you know, the low-lying islands of the Pacific that are disappearing, or, you know, Bangladesh that's flooding, or, you know, you name it. So one of the things that one has to do is make sure that there's not a kind of fear around transition. You talked before about the way that much of the economic base of that part of Washington was built during the New Deal, and with the construction of big hydropower, you know, and even Americans who aren't from that part of the world know those stories because they've, you know, listened to Woody Guthrie sing about them, and, you know, whatever it is. I mean, mighty Columbia is a part of all of our history. Well, this is, you know, this is where the jobs and the possibilities for the next 30 years are coming from. I just did a piece for the New Yorker about what's going on in the oil fields of North Dakota, where, you know, the oil industry is in one of its, probably a terminal kind of bust, and people are out of work, and then they're being quickly retrained as wind turbine technicians because the skill sets overlap, and there you've got jobs that are going to last a lifetime and aren't as hard on the body as the ones that they're replacing, and that aren't going to be busting and booming all the time because we're obviously going to be using electricity for a long time to come. Around the country, we're beginning to understand those kind of possibilities. It's one of the reasons why people shouldn't be sort of scared by this Green New Deal idea. It's really not very different from what we talked about with the New Deal in the 1930s. And what do you know? It's coming at a point when we have the biggest unemployment rate since the 1930s, you know, thanks to the pandemic. So there are real possibilities for people working together to get things done going forward. It's abundantly clear that that's where we're going. The only question, as Paul and Casey have pointed out, is whether we're going to go there fast enough to catch up with climate change. I mean, the worst outcome here is that we, you know, make a 75-year transition to clean energy, at which point we're running a broken planet on sun and wind. That's in nobody's interest. The interest is to do this now when we can, and when we still have an incredibly beautiful world to I mean, you know, I'm talking too much, but I will just say the other reason that I think that rural America is a good place in the end to be talking about all this is because there are an awful lot of people in rural America who understand just how beautiful the world is. People who spend their time hunting and fishing and hiking, and in the Methow Valley cross-country skiing through the, you know, magnificent country that we're privileged to have. And I think as people understand the legacy we're leaving, they get more and more interested in changing that legacy, especially now that it's the economically rational thing to do.
Thank you, Bill. Paul, would you add to that question with your deep knowledge of the local world and the local community and the world of fires? How do you see it affecting people who are struggling most already here in North Central Washington, and what do we do about it?
I would add to Bill's great comments just a couple of ideas that I think science is teaching us right now, and we've been for students at learning. One of them is we have this notion that we can sort of constrain what happens on the Earth, but the Earth is very dynamic, and the more we study in deep time, we realize that change happens often. So change is actually the constant, not stationarity. Earth system processes actually manage people, not the other way around. That's the truth coming out of planet Earth science right now. So changing our thinking to understand that we have ways of being able to cooperate with a variety of processes. We don't get to influence the fact that wildfires will keep coming. We can determine how hot they burn, but wildfires are in our future for a very long time. Another thing is that rural populations are asymmetrically affected by things like this, and they have a disproportionately small vote in how it influences lifeways, the quality of their life, and the reason they live in a rural environment. And I think we need to work to increase the size of the voice of rural populations that are more deeply affected. It goes to, as we look across the U.S., lifeways to people in rural populations are massively affected. They don't get to be the most influential about how the planet is managed forward. They have a smallish voice. I'd love to see that change. I'd love to see that change.
We have entered the rapid fire part of questions, so I'm going to do it real quick. Bill, I know you have to leave us at the top of the hour, and it turns out there's just a small debate tonight at 6 o'clock. But more importantly, perhaps, there's also a phone bank for more for state rep at 6 o'clock. So we will make sure we wrap up. But before I do, Casey, as someone who has, forwarded some policy ideas for Washington State, I think Jacqueline asked earlier, I've lost it in all of the great questions, something about if you could write a climate change policy for Washington State, maybe even one that impacts North Central Washington, in 2 sentences, maybe 4 sentences or less, what is that policy? What would you forward right now to bring us into, the era of hopefully more sustainable practices here?
Yeah, we passed a pretty strong clean energy law, clean electricity law a couple of years ago. And of course, we have some of the most carbon-free electricity in the world. It's why our power is so cheap. It's why our air is relatively clean when it's not smoky, because we rely less on fossil fuels than a lot of other places. I think our big opportunity is really shifting as many things as we can, and especially transportation, over to electricity. Bikes are great, community transit's great, walking is great, alternatives to cars are great, but for those things like we have, especially in the Valley, that where you need your vehicle, you need a small truck, you need your car, shifting over to electricity is a huge opportunity for us. It's much cheaper, and it keeps our local energy dollars in our community. We make our electricity here out of water and wind and solar power. We don't make oil here. We don't make coal here. We don't make uranium here. And all that money we're spending on putting oil in our cars is going straight out of the bottom of our community, producing no economic value. And I got to say, your opponent, who has taken a lot of money from the fossil fuel industry, you can count on him having taken that money to make sure it stays that way. And that's why we need folks like you, Adrianne, representing us in Olympia, because that opportunity is just waiting for us to start using way more clean electricity to get from point A to point B so we can ditch oil.
We should be leaders in the solution to climate change. And I think without a representative who believes in the science, without a representative who's willing to lead on clean energy, we won't be centered in the solution. And North Central Washington, as you say, is already a leader, and we should continue to lead here in Washington State and in North Central Washington. So I appreciate that, Casey. we are genuinely out of time, which breaks my heart because there's so many good questions and so many important people here to feed a conversation that could last all night. So I invite you all to drinks and a bonfire when COVID is over. We will talk with Bill, who, you know, I hear he comes and stays at your house, Casey. So just know we know your secrets, Bill, that you are sometimes here in North Central Washington, and we will invite you for a beer and a maybe a bonfire is a bad analogy, Paul, or a bad invitation. We'll invite you to a beer and a nice soothing night by the river if you come join us here in North Central Washington, Bill. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. It is with incredible joy that I get to be part of this community of people who are willing to work for exactly what Casey and Paul and Bill have been spending their lives working for. And we've got so much good work to do here in North Central Washington, and we are poised and ready to do it. So thanks for being a part of this. I want to just give a couple plugs before we close, because it is a campaign and we are running to win on November 3rd. So here they are. We have had over 230 people sign up to volunteer for this campaign, but we are in the home stretch, which means that we need each and every person to be part of this next 27 days. So canvass with us, make phone calls with us. It is all COVID compliant, but it's also incredibly fun to talk to our neighbors at a time where we are more disconnected than ever. So let us know. You can email staff@voiceofthe12.com. You can also swing your own neighborhood. This is the most exciting part. As votes start to come in, we know who has and hasn't voted. And if you want to be part of getting out in the community and swinging your neighborhood, please do let us know. We can sign wave on Saturdays for the last 3 weeks of the campaign. And of course, we are in the home stretch of fundraising. We have just a few $1,000s to raise, but every dollar we raise over that means that more people hear more of our message across this district. So please come out, give generously. We need every dollar to get us to the home stretch. And mostly, thanks for all you already have given. Thanks for all you have done to get this campaign to this moment. It is truly a Herculean effort. I want to give special thanks to Alana Maynor, our amazing campaign manager. She did this out of the love of her heart, not because she needed a job. So thank you, Alana, for making this. And for Steph and Charlotte, Steph is no longer on the call because she's phone banking, but Steph is our field organizer. Charlotte Massey is our digital organizer and youth organizer, and they are the power behind this incredible campaign. And to all of you who have given and who have been willing to come out and be with us each and every week as we make this district one that is ready to fight for a future for all of us here in North Central Washington. You are a beloved part of our community, so thank you. Thank you, Bill. I mean, truly such a kind and generous offer to join us tonight. Thank you, Casey, for always just saying yes and for being just a point of light in our days when we get to speak with you. And thank you, Paul, for being a new friend to this campaign. But when I came away from talking to you last time, I said, oh God, yes, that's what we got to hear more of. So thank you, Paul, for being part of this. And thank you to all of you in this community. We could not genuinely do it without you. So thanks all. Enjoy the debate. Enjoy your night. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for stepping up, Adrianne.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks all.